Good morning, dear participants. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on the outcomes of the 18th meeting of the Chemical Review Committee and the 18th meeting of the Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee. My name is Andrea Lechner. I'm a program officer in the Secretariat, and I'll be presenting to you the outcomes of the Chemical Review Committee, and then my colleague Kei Ono will speak about the Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee. And at the end, there will be an opportunity for questions, comments, and discussion. So let's start with the Chemical Review Committee. The CRC, as we say, is a subsidiary body under the Rotterdam Convention, and it is responsible for the process of listing new chemicals under the Rotterdam Convention. There are two different tracks for listing new chemicals. One is for the chemicals when a party takes a final regulatory action to severely restrict or prohibit a chemical. It needs to notify the Secretariat of such a final regulatory action. And as soon as there are two notifications from two different, what we call the prior informed consent regions, that fulfill a certain number of criteria, they're put in front of the CRC for review. The second track is particular for developing countries and countries with economies in transition. If they experience problems with severely hazardous pesticide formulations under local conditions of use, they can propose these to be listed under the Rotterdam Convention. So if we look at the 18th meeting of the CRC, there were no severely hazardous pesticide formulations, so we're mainly talking about the first track, the review of final regulatory action notifications. The meeting took place from 19 to 23rd September in FAO headquarters in Rome and was chaired by Ms. Nolusuku Gawai from South Africa. We had 109 participants in the meeting, 31 members and 78 observers. The CRC finalized two draft decision guidance documents. So this is really in very general terms the main outcomes. Two draft decision guidance documents were finalized and notifications of final regulatory action on 10 chemicals were reviewed. And out of these 10, 2 of them were recommended for listing under the convention. 2 pesticides. And on this website, you can find further information about the meeting. So let's look at the first chemical for which draft decision guidance document was finalized, and that is iprodion. So what's important to note is under the CRC, the review works in 2 steps. The first step is that the notification of final regulatory action is reviewed. And if there are 2 meeting the criteria, the chemical is recommended for listing. And then the second step, still at the CRC level, is to prepare a draft decision guidance document for these chemicals. The intention of this document is that once and if the chemical is listed under the convention, all parties are asked if they wish to continue importing that chemical. So quite important to note, there's no prohibition linked to the listing under the Rotterdam Convention, but simply a question to parties: do you wish to continue importing this chemical? And in order to take an informed decision on this question, they have the draft decision guidance document that provides information on this chemical. So the first chemical for which this step was completed is iprodion. It's a fungicide that was notified by the notifying parties for use on wines, fruit trees, and vegetables. And at the CRC.18, there were notifications from Mozambique and the European Union found to meet the criteria in Annex 2 of the Convention. And based on these 2 meeting the criteria, the chemical was recommended for listing. A draft decision guidance document was then developed in the intersessional period between CRC.17 and 18, and CRC.18 revised the draft, adopted it, and forwarded it to the Conference of the Parties. So at this point, the package is completed, the recommendation for listing has been done, the DGD has been finalized, and now it will be considered by the Conference of the Parties for listing, at its next meeting, and that is COP11 in May 2023. And the second chemical for which exactly the same process was completed is turbofos. Turbofos is an insecticide. It was notified for having been used on mice, sorghum, potato, beans, and sugar beets. And then we had notifications of final regulatory action from Mozambique and Canada, found to meet the relevant criteria by CRC.18. DGD was developed, finalized at CRC.18, and now it will also be considered for listing at COP11. Then we come to the chemicals which are still at the first step of the review process. And there are two, that's methyl bromide and paraquat. So they were recommended for listing. Methyl bromide is a pesticide, was notified for having been used as a fumigant, including for quarantine treatment of plants. And you might wish to note that this chemical is covered by the Montreal Protocol. It's an ozone depleting substance. There was an old notification from the Netherlands that was found at the first meeting of the CRC to meet the criteria. So it has been waiting since then for a second notification meeting the criteria. And at that CRC.18, there was a notification from Colombia that met the criteria, so the chemical was recommended for listing. And now a draft DGD is being prepared in the intersessional period. The second chemical that was recommended for listing is paraquat. So paraquat is a pesticide, was notified for use as a herbicide on sugarcane, vegetables, and bananas. And there were two notifications of final regulatory action found to meet the criteria by CRC.18. And now the DGD is being developed. In case paraquat sounds familiar to you under the Rotterdam Convention, this is actually already in front of the Conference of the Parties, but it came through the other track. So the chemical has already been recommended for listing, but as a severely hazardous pesticide formulation. So it's a formulation of liquid formulations containing paraquat dichloride. And since COP6, it is being considered for listing, but there hasn't been yet consensus on the listing. So that was as an SHPF, severely hazardous pesticide formulation, and now the chemical is coming as a substance. So for both of these, there is now a draft decision guidance document being prepared, and you can see here the timeline of the preparation. And I'd like to draw your attention in particular to the second review of the draft, because this is the review where the document will be open for comments by all CRC members and observers. And that is taking place from mid-February to mid-March. So there will be a communication going out from the Secretariat asking for comments on this draft DGD, which will then probably be finalized by CRC.19 next year. So these are definitely not going to the 11th meeting of the Conference of the Parties next year, because the second step is still missing. Only iprodion and turbofos will move forward to the next COP. Then, as mentioned before, there are a couple of other notifications of final regulatory action that were reviewed. On one of them, that is chlorvenvinfos. It's an insecticide used, for example, on vegetables, but also on animals. There were 3 notifications of final regulatory action from Mozambique, Norway, and Turkey. And CRC.18 concluded that the FRA from Norway did meet the criteria. The one from Turkey did not. And then the discussion on the one from Mozambique is not yet finished. There was no consensus yet on whether it meets the criteria. So the discussion of this notification will continue at CRC.19. And since right now there's only the notification from Norway meeting the criteria, that's why this chemical is not moving forward until a second notification meets the criteria. And it needs to be from another PIC region. Then we have 3 chemicals, carbaryl, metidation, and thiodicarb, for which review was completed on a couple of the notifications. They were not found to meet the criteria. However, there are on each of them, there is a notification from Mozambique, and on them also the CRC could not yet reach consensus on whether they meet the criteria. So these also need to be continued at CRC.19. And then finally, these last 4 chemicals, amitrole, carbon tetrachloride, methyl parathion, and Marex. For these also notifications were reviewed and none of them were found to meet the criteria. So these are being put aside. There's no further action taken on them for now. Looking then at other work of CRC.18, there's one I'd like to mention, and that is the identification of substances covered by the listing of PFOA, its salts, and PFOA-related compounds. So these substances were listed by the last conference of the parties, COP10, and in decision RC10/8 on the identification of substances covered by the listing of PFOA, its salts, and PFOA-related compounds, the conference of the parties requested the Secretariat to prepare, in consultation with the Chemical Review Committee, an indicative list of these compounds, and to make the list available on the website and update it periodically. And in response to that request, the Secretariat had prepared a draft indicative list, and that list was presented to CRC.18, and they were invited to provide comments on it by 14 October 2022. And currently the Secretariat is working on updating the list and will then make it available on the convention website. And it will be updated periodically in coordination with the list that is available under the Stockholm Convention, because these chemicals are also listed under Stockholm with a similar entry. So the work is done in coordination for the 2 conventions. The meeting report, we hope to have the English advance available in the next 2 weeks maximum by the end of the month. And then language versions are most likely only coming early next year. The committee agreed to tentatively schedule its next meeting from 2 to 6 October next year, again at the FAO headquarters in Rome, back to back with the 19th meeting of POPRC. And I'd just like to mention briefly the intersessional work now going ahead to CRC.19. So there is a large number of notifications of final regulatory action that are awaiting review by the CRC. So it still needs to be determined how exactly the scheduling will be done of the intersessional work and which FRAs will actually be covered, because most likely there are too many chemicals to take up at one meeting. And in terms of the scheduling, it's very much expected that the intersessional work be started early, most probably after an orientation workshop that is taking place for the CRC members in March next year. So the intention of this intersessional work is that for chemicals that are scheduled for review at the next meeting, there is already a preliminary review of the notifications being done intersessionally. And the intention is to enhance the efficiency of the work of the committee and also the participation of members and observers, so that all members and observers, they get a chance to already review the notifications early on, that the committee sees if there is a need for requesting further information, if there's a need for clarification, for example, from notifying parties. So this is in order to give them some time to prepare their discussions, but then each notification is reviewed in full detail during the CRC meeting. I'd also like to draw your attention to the Handbook of Working Procedures and Policy Guidance for the CRC. This is quite an important document for the CRC in its work. It contains a number of guidance on how it is to proceed in its review of notifications and SHBF proposals. It also contains a couple of past practice, such as reflecting how the committee dealt with certain cases, with the intention of ensuring coherence and consistency over the years of its work. There's also a shorter pocket guide available that describes more succinctly the work of the CRC on this website. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. We can take up any questions you might have at the end after the presentation on the POPs Review Committee And I'll now hand over to my colleague Kei Ono to present you that work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for presentation on CRC. I hope my sound is clear enough. Okay, so I'll start my presentation on the outcomes of the POPRC.18 meeting. The meeting took place from 26 to 30 September 2022 in FAO back-to-back with CRC.18. And prior to the meeting, there was an online pre-meetings on 14 September. Secretariat also organized the orientation workshop online for incoming members in order for them to familiarize with the agenda as well as the procedure. The meeting was chaired by Mr. Peter Dawson from New Zealand, and we had 168 participants attending the meeting. In the meeting, there were 2 chemicals recommended for listing and 2 risk profiles adopted, and the committee finalized 3 reports for submission to the COP. So just getting into the detail, the 2 chemicals recommended for listing. The first one is Decloram Plus. This is a chemical nominated by Norway for listing, and it's a flame retardant applied in several industrial applications. And therefore, the committee found a necessity for having some sort of time-limited specific exemptions. The recommendation for listing had 2 sets of specific exemptions. One that is in accordance with Article 4, which means that the specific exemptions period is for 5 years, and if necessary, parties can request for another 5 years following the process in Article 4. So those are the applications that require some time for phase out. Decloram Plus used in aerospace, space and defense applications, medical imaging and radiotherapy devices and installations. Another set of specific exemptions were identified as necessary for a little longer period because those are the applications used in replacement parts, repair of articles in the applications. So the period identified as necessary is until the end of the service life of the articles or 2044, whichever comes earlier. This includes applications for aerospace, space, defense, motor vehicles, stationary industrial machines for use in agriculture, forestry and construction, marine, garden forestry and outdoor power equipment, medical and in vitro diagnostic devices, medical imaging and radiotherapy devices and installations, instruments for analysis, measurements, control, monitoring, testing, production, and inspection. Some of those applications had footnotes accompanied in this draft, the decision adopted by the POPs Review Committee that describes the examples or a non-exhaustive list of these applications that are described in the proposed specific exemptions. The second chemical recommended for listing was UV328. Similar to Decloram Plus, the committee identified a number of specific exemptions necessary for a certain period of time, even listed in Annex A to the convention. UV328 is another industrial chemicals with multiple applications nominated by Switzerland for listing. And similar to Decloram Plus, the 2 sets of specific exemptions identified are as follows. The first set are for 5 years in accordance with Article 4 with the possibility of extension another 5 years. This is due to the necessary time for phasing out of certain applications currently in use in several countries. The first one is on motor vehicles, then mechanical separators in blood collection tubes, industrial coating applications for automotive coating, engineering, machine coating, rail transit coating and heavy-duty coating for large steel structures, TAC film in polarizers, photographic paper. UV328 is used for protection from the UV, and therefore it's mostly used as a coating to protect those industrial instruments or machines that are listed here. And therefore, some of them require a longer period of time if the parts are to be replaced or repaired. And therefore, the expected period for the longer time is until the end of the service life of the articles or until 2044, whichever comes earlier. Those are for motor vehicles, stationary industrial machines for use in agriculture, forestry, and construction, and liquid crystal displays, LCDs, in medical and in vitro diagnostic devices, liquid crystal displays in instruments for analysis, measurements, control, monitoring, testing, production, and inspection. So these recommendations were sent to parties as well as for information, observers, and signatories by a letter from the Secretariat end of October, together with methoxychlor, which was already recommended for listing in Annex A without any specific exemptions. And those three chemicals will be considered for listing at the 11th meeting of the Conference of Parties in 2023 May. Then the committee considered three other chemicals. First, two chemicals, the committee adopted the risk profile documents. First one is chlorinated paraffins with carbon chain length in the range C14 to 17 and chlorination levels at or exceeding 45% chlorine by weight. Those chemicals were recommended, those chemicals were proposed for listing by the UK. And at last meeting, POPRC.18, the committee was already satisfied that the screening criteria in Annex D have been met. And at the POPRC.18 meeting, the committee finalized and adopted the risk profile, concluded that those chemicals are likely, as a result of their long-range environment transport, to lead to significant adverse human health and environmental effects, such that global action is warranted. Therefore, the committee established an intersessional working group to develop a draft risk management evaluation and invited parties and observers to submit Annex F information related to socioeconomic consideration by 5th of December 2022. Note that short-chain chlorinated paraffins are already listed under the Stockholm Convention in Annex A with several applications as specific exemptions. So those set of chemicals are related to or similar to the chemicals already listed in Annex A to the Convention. Another risk profile adopted was for long-chain perfluorocarboxylic acids, LCPFCAs, their salts and related compounds. Those chemicals were proposed by Canada for listing, and POPRC.17 was satisfied that the Annex D screening criteria were met. POPRC.18 adopted the risk profile and concluded, similar to the chlorinated paraffins, that these long-chain PFCAs also will lead to significant adverse human health and environmental effects, such that global action is warranted, and established an intersessional working group to prepare a draft risk management evaluation. For those chemicals, there was a draft indicative list developed and made available at POPRC.18 meeting. Because long-chain PFCAs, their salts, and especially the related compounds could include several chemicals within this definition, it is useful to refer to this draft indicative list of chemicals so that you know which chemicals could be affected by this consideration. It is currently available on the website as POPRC.18 Inf 14. The last chemical the committee considered was chlorpyrifos. This is a pesticide which is very similar to DDT, like a cousin of DDT, and was proposed for listing by European Union. POPRC.18 was satisfied that the screening criteria have been met, and the draft risk profile was developed for consideration at POPRC.18. However, the committee was unable to conclude whether the draft risk profile meets the all information requirements of Annex E, and it could not conclude whether the chemical, as a result of long-range environmental transport, that it leads to adverse human health and or environmental effects, that it deferred the decision on the draft risk profile to POPRC.19. The committee established an intersessional working group to further revise the draft risk profile and invited parties and observers to submit additional information relating to adverse effects resulting from long-range transport of chlorpyrifos. Also, same deadline, the 5th of December 2022. I mentioned that the committee finalized 3 reports that on the chemicals already listed. The first one was on review of information related to specific exemptions for decabromodiethyl ether. DecaBD was listed already in Annex A to the convention, and the committee was tasked by the COP to review information related to specific exemptions for this chemical, so that the conference the parties can take that information into account when they consider whether certain specific exemption registry needs further extension. So this report was finalized as in 15 Rev 1, together with the similar report on short-chain chlorinated paraffins, which is in 16 Rev 1. During this development of the report, prior to the report and also the submission to COP10, there was no party registered for any of the specific exemptions related to short-chain chlorinated paraffins. However, during the development and as a result of communication with the parties, one party realized that there is a need for register in the specific exemption for both short-chain chlorinated paraffins and DecaBDE, as well as for PFOS salts and PFOS-F. And this, those registry, the notifications have been submitted during the development of this report. And it's been mentioned in the report and will be communicated to parties. And conference the parties are invited to take this information that one party expressed the need for continued use of specific exemptions for short-chain chlorinated paraffins, DecaBD, and PFOS salts and PFOS-F. Now, so the report contained recommendations to the conference the parties, and in the executive summary section. And those short-chain chlorinated paraffins, which are listed already several years ago, the specific exemptions are set to expire on 18 December 2023 for most of the parties. The committee recommended that the conference of parties consider to urge parties to identify as soon as possible the need for specific exemptions and register if such need is identified in accordance with Article 4 of the Convention. And similar to specific exemptions, there is a possibility to also notify articles in use, and therefore committee recommended COP to urge parties to identify such needs and submit the notification. On decabromodiethyl ether, there are a set of applications that set to expire in 5 years, similar to short-chain chlorinated paraffins, but there are two other applications that have a longer period of specific exemptions. One is for parts for use in vehicles that is specified in paragraph 2A of part 9 of Annex A, Those will expire at the end of the service life of legacy vehicles or in 2036, whichever comes earlier. And another one that relates to aircraft, and this shall expire at the end of service life of those aircraft. So it's a bit longer than 5 years, whereas the rest of the specific exemptions are set to expire on 18 December 2023 for most of the parties. Taking those into account, the committee recommended the Conference of Parties to again urge parties to identify the need and register for specific exemptions or notify articles in use. And then for those parties in the register for specific exemptions to provide further information to justify the need for the registration for such exemptions by 31st December 2024. And these reports will be forwarded to the conference of parties and will be considered under agenda item on exemptions. The last report that the committee finalized at the meeting was on PFOS salts and PFOS-F. Those chemicals are listed in Annex B to the Convention with acceptable purposes and specific exemptions. And using this procedure for evaluating the continued need for exemptions, the COP9 have already amended some of the exemptions and on the basis of the recommendations made by the POPs Review Committee. So initially, there were several acceptable purposes and specific exemptions listed in Annex B, but as a result of the COP9 amendment, currently there's only one acceptable purpose, which is for leaf cutting and bites, and two specific exemptions. One is for metal plating, only limited to closed loop application, and another one is for firefighting foam, which is listed in a similar manner as PFOA, salts and PFOA related compounds. So the committee finalized the report on the assessment of alternatives to PFOS, focusing on those three applications, and then provided comments on the draft report prepared by the Secretariat. In the decision adopted by the committee, there are recommendations on PFOS salts and PFOS for those three applications. The first one relates to insect bites with sulframide as an active ingredient for control of leaf-cutting ants. This application is an open application, and it is necessary to also monitor the how PFOS or sulframide applied transform to PFOS in the environment. And this was one of the recommendations already made by the committee in the past. But having evaluated the availability of alternatives, the committee again encouraged additional research and development of alternatives, and where alternatives are available, that they be implemented, as well as additional research and development of alternatives while maintaining the acceptable purposes for the time being. And the committee encouraged, again, parties to consider monitoring activities for sulframide, PFOS, and other relevant degradation products in the different environmental compartments. With regard to specific exemptions on metal plating, noting that the specific exemption is time limited, which is 5 years from the date of entry into force, the committee recommended that the parties consider not to replace the use of PFOS for hard metal plating with chemicals that may exceed POPs characteristics in Annex D, including the degradation products. This is to avoid any regrettable substitution. For firefighting foam, again, this is also time-limited specific exemptions, and it has concluded that alternative processes and practices have also been developed to minimize the release of PFOS from certain applications and training operations. And that the committee recognized that as transition to the use of short-chain PFAS for dispersive applications such as the firefighting foam is not a suitable option from an environmental human health point of view, and that some time may be needed for a transition to alternatives without PFAS. Therefore, did not recommend to change the status of the specific exemptions for those 2 entries as well. The last technical point that committee considered was on long-range environmental transport. During the review of some of the chemicals such as UB328, the committee recognized the need to have further guidance or have some description of how long-range environmental transport criteria is considered by the committee, especially when a chemical such as UB328 has a mechanism to have long-range environmental transport through plastic debris. And therefore, the work started at POPRC.18, and the committee had a draft document already looked at POPRC.17 and 18 meetings. However, since the issue is quite complicated and has lots of other inputs received from various stakeholders, that the document was found to need further time to revise, and therefore committee established another intersessional working group at POPRC.18 to revise the current document, which is set out in INF 21. This work is still ongoing, and the intersessional working group will be revising this document for consideration at POPRC.19 meeting. Right, and so my few last slides will explain a bit more about related work. So methoxychlor was already recommended for listing in Annex A without specific exemption. This is a pesticide and was included in the letter that was sent out to parties notifying that the 3 chemicals will be considered for listing at COP11. Then under the Stockholm Convention, there were several other technical meetings happening over this last quarter of 2022, starting with the BAT-PEP experts meeting that took place last month, and experts finalized the recommendations related to BAT-PEP, as well as its report on dioxins and furans release. Then at the end of October, there was a global coordination group meeting for the GMP that finalized the GMP3 report with their recommendations. And then those inputs were submitted to the second meeting of the Effectiveness Evaluation Committee meeting that took place 1 to 4 November. And the committee finalized its report together with the recommendations. However, the reports will still be open for updating, taking into account additional expert group meetings taking place in the next months. The first one is the DDT expert group meeting, which is actually currently taking place in Geneva, and the PCB small intersession working group meeting taking place in December. So those expert groups will also be finalizing their reports as well as recommendations and feed into the final version of the effectiveness evaluation report that will be submitted as an INF document for the COP11. While their executive summary and recommendations from the Effectiveness Evaluation Committee will be translated into the 6 UN languages and will be submitted for consideration by COP11. Other meetings taking place are from Science to Action workshop in Barcelona. This was held from 17 to 20 October. And the Regional Centers Directors meeting also taking place right now in Geneva. Right, and similar to CRC, we also have pocket guide and handbook to provide information about how to effectively participate in this process for reviewing and listing new chemicals. Thank you very much. So I wonder if you have any questions, please kindly raise your hand. Or write your question in the chat box. Do you see any questions, Andrea or Dan?
I see a raised hand now from Bangladesh.
Okay, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a very nice and elaborate presentation from both of you. Actually, I have one question, that whether you were sending the brief description of the CRC.18 and POPRC.18 to our focal point or not? That's my question.
Thank you for the question. So the report of the meeting will soon be available in English, and that will provide the description of those meetings. We can also make the slides that we used today for all the participants. That can also provide the description of outcomes of those two meetings. Would you like to add anything, Andrea?
Yes, no, the only other thing I can think of is the website. So for the CRC, the website has been updated, POPRC coming soon, where you can also see a short overview of the outcomes of the meetings.
Thank you. Any other questions? While waiting for the question, perhaps Dan can make the file available for download. Thank you, Dan, for downloading option. And I understood that you will also receive the presentation files by email. Right, I don't see any other hands raised for the moment or comments. All right, so thank you very much. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to drop us any emails, and we'd be happy to follow up as necessary. And then we can close the debriefing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate.
Bye-bye.